Sometimes the pain we carry isn't just in our bodies, it's in our hearts. Margaret Lawson knew this better than most, having spent 3 months ignoring the ache in her ear the same way she'd ignored the loneliness since her husband, Thomas, passed. At 68, she'd grown tired of doctors and their questions. Her daughter kept calling, worried, but Margaret was stubborn. She'd been using an old bandage on her ear for weeks. When the pain finally became too much, she found herself at the small clinic where Nurse Clara worked. Clara had been her student. Years ago, with gentle care, Clara began removing the bandage. As the cloth peeled away, Clara stepped back in shock. What she found wasn't what anyone expected. Hidden beneath was a small silver charm that would unlock a secret Thomas had kept. For decades, what had her beloved husband hidden from her, and why? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Lawson had once filled every corner of Willowbrook Elementary with music. For 37 years, she taught 5th graders the magic of melody, watching shy children bloom into confident performers at the annual spring concerts. Her classroom had been a sanctuary of sound piano scales mixing with giggles, recorders squeaking through hot crossbuns, and her own rich alto voice guiding young singers through their first harmonies. Now, the house on Maple Street held a dulled, only silence. She sat in her favorite armchair, the same faded blue velvet where she'd graded music sheets for decades, and stared at the piano that dominated her living room. Thomas's baby grand Steinway, inherited from his mother, stood like a monument to better times. A thick dust cover shrouded its ebony surface, and Margaret couldn't remember the last time she'd lifted it. 2 years, perhaps, maybe longer. The morning light filtered through lace curtains she and Thomas had chosen together at Miller's Hardware when they'd first bought this house in 1981. Everything here held memories of him. The coffee mug with the chipped handle that he'd insisted on using every morning. The reading glasses still perched on the side table next to his crossword puzzle book, frozen on a half-completed Wednesday puzzle from March 15th, 2023, the day before he died. Margaret's fingers traced the arm of her chair, following a pattern worn smooth by years of her nervous habit. She developed it during Thomas's final illness, when sitting in hospital waiting rooms had become her unwelcome specialty. Dr. Williams had called it a sudden cardiac event, medical speak for the heart attack that had stolen her husband while he slept. No warning, no goodbye, no chance for last words. Just Thomas there one morning and gone the next, leaving behind the kind of silence that makes a person question whether they've gone deaf. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9 times. Sarah would call soon, right on schedule. Every Tuesday and Friday at 9:15, her daughter phoned with the same gentle interrogation disguised as concern. "How are you feeling, Mom? Are you eating enough? When did you last see Dr. Patterson?" Sarah meant well, but Margaret had grown weary of being treated like a fragile thing that might break if handled roughly. The truth was, Margaret had already broken. She'd simply gotten good at hiding the pieces. Her son Michael called less frequently, but when he did, it was with updates about his children, Margaret's grandchildren, who lived 3 states away in Colorado. 8-year-old Emma was learning violin, he'd mentioned last month. 12-year-old David had joined the school band on trumpet. Margaret had made appropriate grandmother noises of approval, but the news had struck her like tiny arrows. Music continuing in her family, growing and flourishing, while she sat in this silent house like a relic of her former self. The irony wasn't lost on her. Margaret Lawson, who had spent her career teaching children that music was the universal language of joy, now couldn't bear to hear a single note. She rose from her chair, joints protesting the movement, and walked to the kitchen. The morning routine was always the same. Tea with honey, 2 slices of wheat toast, a glance at yesterday's newspaper that she'd forgotten to read. The kitchen window looked out onto her back garden, where Thomas's tomato plants had long since withered into brown stalks. She'd meant to clean them up before winter, but somehow the seasons had changed without her notice. And now spring was threatening to return whether she was ready or not. The phone rang, right on schedule. "Good morning, sweetheart," Margaret said, settling the receiver against her ear. The same ear that had been causing her such trouble lately. "Mom, you sound tired. Did you sleep well?" Sarah's voice carried that particular mix of love and worry that adult children perfected when their parents reached a certain age. "I slept fine. How are the boys?" Margaret deflected, knowing that talk of her grandsons would occupy at least 10 minutes of the conversation. "They're good, but Mom, I'm more concerned about you. Mrs. Henderson mentioned she hasn't seen you at the grocery store in weeks. Are you eating properly?" Margaret bristled. Gladys Henderson had been the neighborhood busybody for as long as anyone could remember, and apparently retirement hadn't slowed her surveillance activities. "I'm perfectly capable of feeding myself, Sarah. I've been managing just fine for 68 years. "I know you have, but—" Sarah's voice took on that careful tone she used when approaching sensitive topics. "It's just that Dad always handled the shopping, and I worry that you're not taking care of yourself the way you should." The mention of Thomas sent a familiar ache through Margaret's chest. Sarah was right, of course. Thomas had taken over the grocery shopping in recent years, claiming he enjoyed it, but Margaret now suspected he'd been protecting her from the well-meaning condolences of neighbors, who meant well but whose sympathy felt like salt in an open wound. "I've been getting groceries delivered," Margaret said, which was partially true. She'd had one delivery from the new service in town, though she'd found the selection disappointing and the delivery boy too cheerful for her current disposition. "That's good," Sarah said, relief evident in her voice. "And have you given any more thought to joining that grief support group at the community center? Mrs. Patterson mentioned it might help. I don't need to sit in a circle discussing my feelings with strangers," Margaret interrupted, perhaps more sharply than she'd intended. "I'm managing my grief just fine on my own." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken words. Margaret knew her daughter wanted to argue, wanted to point out that hiding in the house for 2 years wasn't actually managing anything. But Sarah had inherited her father's diplomatic nature, and she let the moment pass. "Well, if you change your mind," Sarah said finally, "the offer stands. I love you, Mom." "I love you too, sweetheart." After hanging up, Margaret remained in the kitchen, studying her reflection in the window. The woman looking back at her seemed older than 68, with silver hair that had grown longer than she'd ever wanted, and eyes that held a weariness she didn't remember from before. Thomas used to say her eyes were the color of warm honey, but now they just looked tired. She'd always been the strong one in their marriage, the one who handled crises with calm efficiency, who kept their household running smoothly while Thomas pursued his gentle passions for woodworking and gardening. But Thomas had been her anchor, the steady presence that made her strength feel effortless. Without him, she felt like a ship that had lost its moorings, drifting in waters she no longer recognized. The house settled around her with its familiar creaks and sighs. 43 years they'd lived here, watching the neighborhood change around them. Young families had moved in and out. Children had grown up and moved away. And through it all, Margaret and Thomas had been the constants, the music teacher and her carpenter husband, who waved from their front porch and brought casseroles to new neighbors. Now, she was just the widow who kept her curtains drawn and her music silenced. Margaret returned to her chair and picked up the book she'd been trying to read for the past month, a mystery novel Sarah had recommended. But the words blurred together, and her mind wandered to the conversation with Clara yesterday at the clinic. Nurse Clara Martinez, who had once been little Clara Esperanza, sitting in the front row of Margaret's 5th grade, Music class with bright eyes and a voice like silver bells. Clara had grown into a kind woman with gentle hands and a way of making medical procedures feel less clinical. When she'd begun removing that ridiculous bandage Margaret had been using to cover her ear, there had been something almost ceremonial about her movements. Careful, deliberate, respectful. And then she'd found the charm. Margaret's hand moved unconsciously to her ear, still tender from months of ignored pain. The tiny silver musical note that Clara had discovered wasn't just unexpected, it was impossible. Margaret had no memory of putting it there, no recollection of Thomas placing it there, no explanation for how it had come to rest in such an intimate, hidden place, but it was unmistakably Thomas's style. He'd always been one for small, romantic gestures, wildflowers left on her pillow, love notes tucked into her lunch bag, surprise serenades when she least expected them. Even after 45 years of marriage, he'd maintained the courtship habits that had won her heart in college. The charm was beautiful in its simplicity, clearly crafted with care. The silver had a warm patina that spoke of age, and the musical note was perfectly proportioned, no bigger than her thumbnail, but exquisitely detailed. When Clara had placed it in her palm, Margaret had felt a jolt of recognition that went deeper than memory. She'd seen this charm before. She was certain of it. But where and when remained frustratingly elusive. Margaret set down her unread book and walked to the piano. For the first time in months, she lifted the dust cover, folding it carefully and setting it aside. The Steinway's surface was immaculate. Thomas had always kept it polished to a mirror shine, and apparently dust hadn't dared to settle in his absence. She opened the bench where they'd kept their sheet music collection. Neat piles of arrangements, songbooks, and handwritten compositions filled the space, organized by Thomas's meticulous system. Everything in its place, everything labeled and dated. Mozart here, Christmas carols there, folk songs arranged by difficulty level. And there, tucked into the very back corner where she might have missed it entirely, was a manila envelope with her name written in Thomas's careful script. Margaret's breath caught. She pulled out the envelope with trembling fingers, noting its weight, its unsealed flap. The way her name was written with the particular flourish Thomas had always added to the man in Margaret. Inside were 3 items: a photograph, a small piece of paper, and another silver charm identical to the one Clara had found. The photograph was from their wedding day, 45 years ago. She and Thomas stood at the altar of First Presbyterian, young and radiant, lost in each other's eyes. But it wasn't their faces that made Margaret's heart skip. It was Thomas's boutonniere. There, pinned among the white roses, was a tiny silver musical note charm. The piece of paper was a receipt from Hartley's Jewelry, dated just 3 weeks before Thomas's death. 2 silver musical note charms, custom engraved with their wedding date. Margaret sank onto the piano bench, the pieces of Thomas's puzzle beginning to arrange themselves in her mind. He'd planned this. Somehow, in those final weeks when his heart was already failing, he'd orchestrated this moment, this discovery that would reach across death to remind her of who they'd been together. But why her ear? Why such an unusual hiding place? And how had he managed it without her knowledge? The questions multiplied, but underneath them was a deeper realization that made her hands shake as she held the photograph. Thomas had known he was dying. And instead of telling her, instead of preparing her for goodbye, he'd spent his final days planning ways to make her smile. It was so perfectly, heartbreakingly Thomas that Margaret finally did what she hadn't been able to do in 2 years of widowhood. She cried. The tears came in waves Margaret hadn't experienced since the funeral. They started quietly, just dampness at the corners of her eyes as she stared at the wedding photograph. But as the full weight of Thomas's planning settled over her, the careful composure she'd maintained for 2 years finally cracked. He'd known. Thomas had known he was dying, And instead of burdening her with that knowledge, he'd spent his precious final weeks crafting this elaborate love letter that would reach her when she needed it most. The silver charm in her ear hadn't been random. It had been placed with the careful precision of a man who understood his wife's stubborn independence and knew exactly how long it would take her to seek medical help. Margaret clutched the photograph to her chest and sobbed for the husband who had loved her enough to orchestrate his own goodbye, and for herself, who had been too afraid to properly grieve until this moment. When the tears finally subsided, she felt hollowed out, but strangely clearer. The fog that had surrounded her thoughts for months seemed to lift slightly, allowing her to focus on the mystery Thomas had left behind. She studied the receipt from Hartley's jewelry more carefully, noting the precise date, February 22, 2023. Thomas had died on March 16th. 3 weeks of planning, 3 weeks of preparation she'd been completely unaware of. What else had he planned during those final weeks? Margaret walked to Thomas's workshop in the basement, a space she'd avoided since his death. The familiar smell of wood shavings and linseed oil hit her as she descended the stairs, and for a moment she could almost hear the gentle rasp of his sandpaper against oak. The workshop was exactly as he'd left it, tools hanging in their designated spots. Half-finished projects waiting for hands that would never return to complete them. She began searching methodically, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was looking for. Thomas had been organized to a fault, labeling everything from nail containers to lumber scraps. Surely, if he'd been planning something as elaborate as the charm placement, there would be evidence here in his desk drawer beneath. A stack of woodworking magazines. She found a small notebook she'd never seen before. The cover was plain black leather, worn smooth from handling. Inside, Thomas's careful handwriting filled page after page with what appeared to be a detailed project plan, but not for any piece of furniture. Operation Breadcrumbs, he'd titled it, with a date that made Margaret's heart skip. January 15th, 2023, 2 months before his death. The first entry was simple but devastating. Dr. Patterson confirmed what I suspected. Heart is failing faster than we hoped. Margaret doesn't know, and I won't burden her with countdown anxiety, but I need to prepare her for what comes after. Margaret sank into Thomas's workshop chair, reading with growing amazement and heartbreak. Page after page detailed his observations of her growing isolation, his concerns about her future happiness, and his elaborate plan to guide her back to the music and community she'd abandoned in her grief. The charm placement will be tricky, one entry read. Need to wait for the right moment when she's sleeping deeply. The ear infection she's been ignoring will eventually force her to seek help, stubborn as she is. Probably not for months. Clara Martinez works at the clinic now. She handled it with the care Margaret deserves. Another entry. Contacted Jim at Hartley's about custom charms. He remembers making our wedding boutonniere piece and can match it exactly. 2 charms, one for discovery, one for the piano bench. She'll find the second when she's ready to look. Thomas had anticipated her every move, predicted her stubborn delays, even chosen the specific nurse who would make the discovery. The depth of his planning was both touching and overwhelming. Margaret flipped through more pages, finding detailed notes about their former students, contact information for colleagues, and what appeared to be plans for something much larger than just the charm discovery. References to the concert appeared frequently, along with names and phone numbers of people from their shared past. A loose piece of paper fell from between the notebook pages. It was a medical chart copy, Thomas's chart with test results, and doctor's notes that painted a clear picture of his declining condition. He'd been seeing Dr. Patterson regularly during those final months, receiving treatments and medications Margaret knew nothing about. The betrayal stung, even wrapped in love as it was. How had he hidden doctor's appointments, medical tests, the physical signs of his failing heart? How had she been so oblivious to her husband's suffering? But as she read further, the answer became clear. Thomas had been protecting her just as carefully as he'd been planning for her future. Every appointment scheduled during her teaching hours, every symptom downplayed or explained away, every moment of pain hidden behind his gentle smile. He'd carried the burden of his dying alone so that she could continue living without the shadow of impending loss. Margaret found herself caught between admiration and anger. The man had orchestrated his own death like a chess master planning 20 moves ahead, and she'd been a pawn who never saw the game being played. Her phone rang upstairs, the sound echoing through the quiet house. Margaret climbed from the basement, Thomas's notebook clutched in her hands, and answered without checking the caller ID. "Mrs. Lawson, this is Clara Martinez from the clinic. I hope I'm not disturbing you, Clara." Margaret's voice was rougher than she'd expected, still thick from crying. "No, you're not disturbing me. I wanted to check on your ear, make sure. The pain has subsided." But also, Clara paused, choosing her words carefully. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about that charm we found yesterday. It's been bothering me, and I think I know why." Margaret gripped the phone tighter. "Oh, Mrs. Lawson, I need to tell you something." About 3 weeks before Mr. Thomas passed away, he came to the clinic. Not for himself. He said he was picking up some reading materials for you about hearing health. But he stayed and chatted with me for almost an hour. The notebook in Margaret's free hand suddenly felt heavier. "He talked about you a lot," Clara continued. "About how proud he was of your teaching career, how worried he was that you've been having trouble with your ear, but were too stubborn to get it checked. He asked specific questions about our procedures, about how we handle bandage removal, about which nurses worked which shifts." Margaret closed her eyes, seeing the full scope of Thomas's planning with crystal clarity. "He specifically asked if I worked Tuesdays," Clara said quietly. "And he mentioned that when you finally came in, he said when, not if, that you'd probably need someone gentle, someone who knew you personally. Mrs. Lawson, I think he was planning for yesterday to happen exactly the way it did." The confirmation of what Margaret had already begun to suspect hit her like a physical blow. Thomas hadn't just planned the charm placement. He'd orchestrated the entire discovery, choosing the day, the nurse, even the method of revelation. Theirs. "Something else," Clara said. "He gave me an envelope that day, asked me to hold on to it and give it to you when the time was right. I think that time might be now." Margaret's legs gave out, and she sank into the nearest chair. "An envelope?" "He was very specific about the timing. He said I'd know when you were ready to receive it. After yesterday, after seeing how you reacted to finding the charm, I think you're ready. Would you like me to bring it by?" Margaret looked around her silent house, at Thomas's reading glasses still sitting on the side table, at the piano that had been uncovered for the first time in 2 years, at the notebook full of his careful plans for her future. She thought about the tears she'd finally allowed herself to shed, about the fog lifting from her mind, about the possibility that Thomas's love had been powerful enough to reach across death and guide her home. "Yes," she whispered. "Please bring it by." After hanging up, Margaret sat in the growing afternoon light, Thomas's notebook open in her lap. She turned to a page near the back, where his handwriting had grown slightly shakier. The entries dated just days before his death. If she's reading this, the final entry began. Then the first phase worked. She found the charm, found this notebook, and hopefully found her tears. The hardest part is over, my dear one. Now comes the real gift, not just the memory of what we had, but the possibility of what she can still become. Clara has the next piece. Trust her, trust the plan, and trust that love doesn't end just because a heart stops beating. Margaret traced the words with her finger, feeling Thomas's presence so strongly it was almost as if he were sitting beside her. The man had turned his own death into an elaborate love song, composed specifically for her and timed to play exactly when she needed to hear it most. For the first time since the funeral, Margaret Lawson smiled. Clara arrived within the hour, carrying a manila envelope identical to the one Margaret had found in the piano bench. The young nurse looked nervous as Margaret invited her into the living room, her eyes taking in the uncovered piano and the scattered papers on the coffee table. "I hope I'm not overstepping," Clara said, settling into the chair across from Margaret. "When Mr. Thomas asked me to hold this, I thought it was just a sweet gesture from a worried husband. But after yesterday, after seeing your reaction to the charm, I realized this was something much bigger." Margaret accepted the envelope with steady hands, though her heart was racing. "He planned all of this, didn't he? Every detail." "I think so," Clara said softly. "He knew you better than you knew yourself." The envelope was heavier than expected, and when Margaret opened it, she found several items nestled inside. First was a letter in Thomas's handwriting, folded around a small key. Beneath that was another photograph, this one showing Margaret and Thomas at their college graduation, both wearing academic regalia and huge smiles. In the photo, Thomas wore a boutonniere that matched their wedding day, complete with the tiny silver charm. But it was the third item that made Margaret gasp, a small jewelry box, the kind used for rings or delicate necklaces. Inside, nestled in white satin, was a silver chain with a pendant. Not just any pendant, but a miniature replica of the music box that had played their wedding song. "He had this made," Margaret whispered, lifting the delicate piece. The craftsmanship was exquisite. Every detail of the original music box, captured in silver no bigger than a quarter. Clara leaned forward, studying the pendant. "Mrs. Lawson, do you remember that music box?" "Of course. It was my grandmother's. Thomas gave it to me on our first anniversary, said it reminded him of how our love made beautiful music together." Margaret's voice caught slightly. "I haven't seen it in years. I thought it was lost in the attic somewhere." "Maybe it's not lost," Clara suggested gently. "Maybe it's waiting to be found, just like this was." Margaret unfolded Thomas's letter, recognizing immediately the careful script he'd used for all his important correspondence. The paper was his good stationery, cream-colored with his initials embossed at the top. "My dearest Margaret," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then my first surprise worked, and Clara has decided you're ready for the second. I hope you're not too angry with me for the deception, though I suspect you are. You always could see through my schemes, except when I really put my mind to hiding them." Margaret could almost hear his voice in the words, the gentle humor he'd used to diffuse her occasional temper. "By now you've found my notebook, and you know that I was aware of what was coming. I'm sorry I didn't tell you directly, but we both know you would have spent our final weeks focused on my dying instead of our living. I couldn't bear to watch you practice being a widow while I was still here to hold you." Tears blurred Margaret's vision, but she continued reading. "The pendant you're holding is more than just jewelry, my love. It's a key, literally and figuratively. Do you remember the music box? And more importantly, do you remember what I told you it contained?" "Our future," I said. "I was being more literal than you knew." Margaret lowered the letter, her mind racing back through decades of marriage. The music box had been a fixture on their bedroom dresser for years, playing its sweet melody whenever she wound the tiny key. But Thomas's words about it containing their future had always seemed like romantic nonsense, the kind of sweet declaration young husbands made to impress their wives. What did he mean? She asked Clara, though she knew the nurse couldn't possibly have the answer. "Keep reading," Clara encouraged. "I think he explains everything." Margaret returned to the letter. "The little key with this letter opens the music box, but not the way you think. Remember how the bottom always felt heavier than it should? There's a secret compartment, Margaret. I had it modified during our first year of marriage to hold something Special something I've been adding to for 45 years. The small brass key seemed to grow warm in Margaret's palm. She examined it closely, noting its ornate design and unusual size. It was too small for any door, too decorative for any ordinary lock. I hid love letters there, my darling. One for every anniversary, every birthday, every Christmas morning. 45 years of letters I wrote to you, but never gave. Because some things are too precious for everyday reading. They were meant for a time when you might need reminding of how completely you are loved. Margaret's hand flew to her throat. 45 years of letters, hidden just feet from where she slept. Every night. All those mornings she'd wound the music box to hear their wedding song, never knowing it contained a treasure trove of Thomas's private thoughts. But here's the real gift, Margaret. The letters aren't just about the past. In those final weeks, when I knew time was growing short, I wrote different kinds of letters. Instructions, if you will. A roadmap for rediscovering the woman you were before grief tried to steal her away. Clara reached over and squeezed Margaret's free hand. He really did think of everything. The pendant around your neck opens the compartment, the letter continued. But the music box itself is in our bedroom closet, top shelf, behind the winter coats. I moved it there after my diagnosis, knowing you'd need privacy when you finally found it. Take your time reading the letters, my love. Some of them might sting a little. I was never one to sugarcoat hard truths, even in love letters. But trust the process, trust the plan, and most importantly, trust yourself. Margaret set down the letter and looked at Clara, who was watching her with professional concern and personal affection. I'm afraid, Margaret admitted. What if the letters say things I'm not ready to hear? What if Thomas knew me better than I know myself, and his advice leads somewhere I'm not prepared to go? Clara considered this carefully before responding. Mrs. Lawson, in my experience, the things we're most afraid to hear are usually the things we most need to learn. And Mr. Thomas, he loved you too much to lead you anywhere that wasn't good for you. Margaret stood abruptly, the pendant clutched in her fist. I need to find that music box. Would you like me to come with you? Clara offered. No, Margaret said, then reconsidered. Actually, yes. I think I might need a witness to my husband's final magic trick. They climbed the stairs together, Margaret moving with more purpose than she'd felt in months. The bedroom looked exactly as it had the morning Thomas died. His side of the bed still slightly rumpled. His book still open on the knit-stand. His reading glasses still folded on top of his crossword puzzle. The closet was a testament to 45 years of shared space. Thomas's clothes hung meekly on the right side, sorted by season and occasion. Margaret's occupied the left, though she'd been living in the same 3 or 4 comfortable outfits since his death. The top shelf was harder to reach than she remembered, filled with boxes of Christmas decorations and out-of-season clothing. Behind the winter coats, exactly where Thomas had said it would be, was the music box Margaret had forgotten how beautiful it was. Made of polished cherry wood with intricate brass fittings, it was the size of a jewelry box, but felt substantial in her hands. The top was decorated with a delicate inlay of musical notes, and when she wound the key on the side, it still played their wedding song, "The Way You Look Tonight," in perfect crystalline notes. But Thomas was right about the weight. The bottom felt heavier than the simple mechanism should require. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, Clara beside her, and studied the pendant. It was designed to look decorative, but she could see now that the bottom edge was actually a tiny key, shaped to fit an almost invisible keyhole on the music box's base. When she inserted the pendant and turned it, she heard a soft click. The bottom panel of the music box slid away, revealing a hidden compartment lined with red velvet. Inside were dozens of letters, each one folded carefully and dated in Thomas's precise handwriting. The earliest was dated September 15th, 1978, the day after their wedding. The most recent was dated March 10th, 2023, just 6 days before his death. Margaret lifted the first letter with trembling fingers, but Clara gently stopped her. "Maybe," Clara suggested quietly, "you should start with the most recent one. I think that's what Mr. Thomas would want." Margaret found the final letter, knowing how his handwriting had grown shaky but remained determined. When she unfolded it, a small piece of paper fell out, another name and address, written in different ink. The letter was brief. "My darling, if you found these letters, then the hardest part of my plan worked. You left the house. You trusted Clara, and you followed the breadcrumbs I left for you. Now comes the real journey. Not just remembering who we were together, but discovering who you can still become. The address enclosed is your first step. When you're ready, and you'll know when that is, go there. As for Elena, tell her Thomas sent you. And Margaret, wear the pendant. She want to see it." Margaret stared at the address. 142 Harmony Lane. She knew that street. It was in the Arts District downtown, where several music studios and galleries had opened in recent years. "Who's Elena?" Clara asked, reading over Margaret's shoulder. "I have no idea," Margaret replied. But even as she said it, something stirred in her memory. Elena. The name was familiar, though she couldn't place it. Another piece of Thomas's elaborate puzzle. Another breadcrumb in the trail he'd laid for her to follow. She looked around their bedroom, seeing it differently now. This wasn't just the place where Thomas had died. It was the place where he'd planned her resurrection. After Clara left, Margaret spent the evening reading through Thomas's letters by chronological order. Each one was a window into their shared life, written from his perspective, with the kind of honest reflection that only comes in private moments. The early letters were full of young love and hope, his thoughts after their first Christmas as newlyweds, his excitement when she got her first teaching position, his dreams for their future children. But it was the middle years that surprised her most. Letters from difficult periods she'd forgotten or minimized in memory. Thomas writing about her miscarriages with a depth of grief she hadn't realized he'd felt. His thoughts during her mother's long illness, when Margaret had been so focused on caregiving that she'd barely noticed her own exhaustion. His pride when she'd received the district's Teacher of the Year award, and his quiet concern when the job stress had begun affecting her health. "You carry everyone's burdens as if they were your own," he'd written after a particularly difficult school year. "I watch you pour yourself out for your students, for your family, for me, and I worry that you'll forget to save anything for yourself. Promise me that when you're older, when the teaching years are behind you, you'll remember that Margaret Lawson is worth caring for too." The words hit her like a physical blow. Here was Thomas, 20 years ago, predicting exactly the trap she'd fallen into after his death. She'd spent so many years defining herself through service to others that when there was no one left to serve, she'd simply disappeared. The most recent letters were different in tone, less romantic reflection and more practical guidance. Thomas had clearly written them as a roadmap for her grief journey, each one building on the last to guide her towards specific realizations. "You'll resist going to see Elena," one letter warned. "You'll convince yourself that whatever I've planned is too much, too public, too risky for your tender heart. But trust me, my love Elena is exactly what you need, when you need it. She's been waiting for you almost as long as I have." Margaret set down the letter and picked up the address again. 142 Harmony Lane. The Arts District was only 20 minutes from her house, but it felt like another world. She hadn't been downtown in over a year, preferring the safe cocoon of her neighborhood where familiar faces offered gentle nods rather than questions about how she was managing. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Michael's number appeared on the caller ID, which was unusual for a Wednesday evening. "Hi, sweetheart," she answered, noting how her voice sounded different than it had even this morning. Less hollow, more present. "Mom, I'm glad I caught you. I've been thinking about our conversation last month, about Emma learning violin. I know you mentioned you might have some beginner music books. And I was wondering, he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I was wondering if you'd consider teaching her yourself. Via video call, maybe? She's been asking about her musical grandma. Margaret's heart skipped. Teaching again, even informally, even virtually. The idea should have terrified her, but instead, she felt a flutter of something that might have been excitement. I haven't taught in 2 years, Michael. I'm not sure I remember how. Mom, you taught for 37 years. That doesn't just disappear. His voice was gentle but firm. And Emma specifically asked for you. She said she wants to learn from someone who really loves music, not just someone who knows the notes. Margaret closed her eyes, remembering the joy of watching children discover their own musical voices. Emma was 8, the perfect age for beginning violin, old enough to develop proper technique, but young enough to approach music with pure enthusiasm. What if I'm rusty? What if I've forgotten more than I remember? Then you'll figure it out together. That's what good teachers do, right? They learn alongside their students. After promising to think about it, Margaret hung up and returned to Thomas's letters. She was beginning to see the pattern in his planning, each revelation building on the last, each step designed to draw her gradually back into the world of the living. She found herself wondering about Elena again. The name definitely seemed familiar, but she couldn't place it in the context of anyone she knew personally. Thomas's letters suggested this was someone who'd been waiting for her, which implied a connection she'd somehow forgotten or overlooked. Margaret walked to Thomas's workshop and retrieved his Operation Breadcrumbs notebook. Perhaps there were more clues there about this mysterious Elena and what role she played in his elaborate plan. Flipping through the pages more carefully this time, she found several references to someone called E. Initial mentions were cryptic. Called E today. Confirmed she's still interested. And E. says timing will be crucial, but she's committed to the long-term plan. But toward the end of the notebook, Thomas had become more specific. Elena Vasquez still runs the studio on Harmony Lane. Spoke with her at length about Margaret's situation. She remembers Margaret from the district music festivals, says she's been hoping for years that Margaret might consider collaboration. Perfect timing that she's expanded into adult education programs. Elena Vasquez. The name hit Margaret like lightning dots. She did know Elena, not personally, but by reputation. Elena had been the district's premier piano instructor for private students. The teacher all the advanced kids wanted to study with before college auditions. Margaret had seen her at music festivals and district events, had heard other teachers speak of her with the kind of reverence reserved for true artists. But what would Elena Vasquez want with a retired elementary music teacher who hadn't touched a piano in 2 years? Margaret found her laptop a gift from Sarah that had mostly gathered dust since Thomas's death and searched for Elena's studio. The website was elegant and professional, featuring photos of a beautiful space with multiple pianos and practice rooms. The About section described Elena as a concert pianist turned educator, specializing in both youth development and adult music education. One phrase caught Margaret's attention. It's never too late to rediscover your musical voice. Many of our most dedicated students are adults returning to music after years away, finding it a source of healing and renewed purpose. The words felt like they'd been written specifically for her situation. Margaret scrolled through testimonials from students, many of them adults who'd taken up piano again after retirements, divorces, or other life transitions. Their stories spoke of music as medicine, as a bridge back to joy, as a way of honoring both past and future selves. One testimonial was from a widow named Ruth, age 72. I hadn't played piano since my husband died 5 years ago. Elena helped me understand that music doesn't belong to the past. It belongs to whoever is brave enough to make it in the present. Now I play for myself, for my grandchildren, and sometimes I swear I can feel my husband listening. Margaret closed the laptop and returned to Thomas's letters, looking for more guidance about Elena and what he'd hoped would happen between them. She found it in one of his final entries. Elena understands grief in ways most people don't. She lost her own husband 3 years ago and had to rebuild her relationship with music from the ground up. She knows that teaching isn't just about technique. It's about helping people find their way back to themselves. When you meet her, you'll understand why I knew she was perfect for this part of the plan. The letter continued. I've arranged for her to hold a place in her adult education program, but only when you're ready. Don't go because you think you should or because you think I expect it. Go because some part of you remembers what it felt like to make music with joy and wants to feel that way again. Margaret set down the letter and walked to the piano. For the first time since uncovering it, she sat on the bench and placed her hands on the keys. They felt foreign at first, her fingers uncertain of their positions. But muscle memory began to return as she played a simple scale, then a chord progression, then the opening measures of Für Elise, a piece she taught to hundreds of students over the years. Her technique was rusty, her timing uncertain, but the music was still there. Buried under months of silence and grief, but alive, waiting to be rediscovered as the last notes faded. Margaret heard something she hadn't noticed in 2 years. The house wasn't silent anymore. The piano had filled it with sound, with possibility, with the echo of who she used to be. For the first time since finding Thomas's charm, Margaret began to believe that his plan might actually work. Over the next week, Margaret found herself gradually returning to routines she'd abandoned. She made actual grocery runs instead of relying on delivery, spent time in Thomas's garden, planning what to plant come spring, and most surprisingly, began practicing piano daily. Her fingers remembered more than she'd expected, though her stamina was limited after years of neglect. Each morning she read one of Thomas's letters with her coffee, treating them like daily devotions that guided her thoughts for the day. His words were like having him back in small doses. His humor, his wisdom, his gentle challenges to her stubborn nature. You're probably overthinking the Elena situation, one letter predicted with uncanny accuracy. You're making lists of reasons. Why you're not ready, why it's too soon, why you might embarrass yourself. Stop it. The Margaret I married never let fear of imperfection keep her from trying something worthwhile. He was right, of course. Margaret had been making mental lists. All week her skills were too rusty. She'd been out of the music community too long. She wasn't the teacher she used to be. But underneath the excuses was a deeper fear. What if returning to music meant having to feel everything she'd been avoiding? The decision was made for her when Sarah called with unexpected news. Mom, I hope you don't mind, but I mentioned to Mrs. Patterson at the grocery store that you'd been playing piano again. She got so excited apparently her granddaughter, Julia, is looking for a piano teacher, and Mrs. Patterson remembered how much you loved teaching. Margaret felt a familiar flutter of panic mixed with interest. Sarah, I'm not sure I'm ready to take on students. I know. But here's the thing. Julia is 16 and has been playing for years, but her teacher moved away last month. She's got a recital coming up in May and needs someone to help her polish a few pieces. It wouldn't be starting from scratch, just some coaching with someone who really understands music. Margaret found herself thinking about Elena's testimonial from the widow who'd returned to playing. The courage it must have taken to sit at a piano again after years of silence. To risk feeling everything that music could unlock. What pieces? Is she working on? Margaret heard herself ask. I'm not sure, but Mrs. Patterson said, Julia specifically asked if there was any chance you might be available. Apparently, she remembered you from elementary school and always thought you were the best music teacher she'd ever had. After the call, Margaret sat at her own piano and wondered what it would feel like to guide another musician through their struggles with a piece. The technical challenges were one thing, But the real teaching happened in the spaces between notes, helping students find their own musical voice, building confidence through patient encouragement, celebrating the moment. When everything clicked, she missed it. The realization hit her suddenly and completely. She missed the unique joy of watching musical understanding dawn in someone's eyes. Missed the privilege of being present for those breakthrough moments when a student finally made a piece their own. Margaret picked up the phone and called Sarah. "Back. Tell Mrs. Patterson I'd be happy to work with Julia, but just for the recital pieces. I'm not ready to take on a regular student yet." "Mom, that's wonderful. She'd be so pleased." "And Mom, I'm proud of you." After hanging up, Margaret felt a mixture of excitement and terror. She had 3 days to prepare before Julia's first lesson, 3 days to remember not just how to play, but how to teach. She spent them reviewing basic pedagogy, practicing scales to rebuild her finger strength, and reading more of Thomas's letters for courage. Teaching was never just your job, one letter reminded her. It was your calling, your gift, your way of making the world more beautiful one student at a time. That gift doesn't disappear because you're grieving. If anything, it becomes more precious because you understand now how fragile and important beautiful things really are. When Julia Patterson arrived Thursday afternoon, Margaret felt a rush of nostalgia. The teenager was tall and graceful, with the kind of focused energy Margaret remembered from her most dedicated students. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd been playing piano seriously for years, but her eyes held the uncertainty all musicians felt before performing. "Mrs. Lawson, thank you so much for agreeing to help me," Julia said as Margaret led her to the piano. "I know you're tired, and I hope this isn't too much trouble." "It's no trouble at all," Margaret replied, and was surprised to realize she meant it. "Tell me about the pieces you're working on." Julia opened her music folder. With the careful reverence Margaret remembered from serious students. "I'm playing Chopin's Minute Waltz and Debussy's Clair de Lune. I can get through both of them, but my teacher always said they needed more." She paused, searching for the right word. "More feeling, I guess. Like I understood the notes, but not the music." Margaret smiled, recognizing the eternal student struggle between technical proficiency and emotional expression. "Play them for me. Don't worry about mistakes. I want to hear how you interpret them." As Julia began the Chopin, Margaret found herself slipping back into teaching mode with surprising ease. She listened not just to the notes, but to the spaces between them, to the choices Julia made about phrasing and dynamics, to the story the young woman was trying to tell through the music. The technique was solid. Julia's previous teacher had built a good foundation. But the performance felt careful, restrained, as if Julia were afraid to let her own personality shine through the classical framework. When she finished both pieces, Julia looked up expectantly. "I know they need work. I just don't know how to make them more alive, I guess." Margaret moved to sit beside her on the piano bench, a position that had felt natural thousands of times before. "Tell me what you think about when you play the Debussy. What do you see? What do you feel?" Julia considered carefully. "It's supposed to be about moonlight, right? So I try to think about peaceful nighttime scenes. But honestly, Mrs. Lawson, I mostly think about not making mistakes." Margaret laughed, remembering countless students who'd struggled with the same performance anxiety. "That's completely normal, but it's also what's holding you back. Let me show you something." She placed her hands on the keys and began playing the opening measures of Clair de Lune, but slowly, with deliberate attention to each phrase. "Don't think about moonlight in general," she said as she played. "Think about one specific moment when moonlight meant something to you. A walk with someone you cared about, a quiet moment in your room, anything real and personal." As Margaret continued playing, she found herself thinking about late nights with Thomas, sitting on their back porch watching the moon over his garden. The music began to carry that specific tenderness, that particular quality of shared silence. That had defined their most peaceful moments together. When she finished, Julia was staring at her with wide eyes. "How did you do that?" It was the same notes, but it felt completely different. "Because I wasn't playing Debussy's Moonlight," Margaret explained. "I was playing mine. The composer gives you the framework, but you have to fill it with your own." Truth. What moments in your life have felt like moonlight to you? They spent the next hour working through both pieces, not focusing on technical corrections, but on finding Julia's personal connection to the music. Margaret felt years of teaching experience flowing back, the patience to let students discover their own interpretations, the instinct for when to push and when to encourage, the deep satisfaction of watching musical understanding bloom. By the end of the lesson, Julia's playing had transformed. The notes were the same, but they carried weight now, emotion that came from genuine experience rather than generic mood. "Mrs. Lawson," Julia said as she packed up her music, "would you consider teaching me beyond just the recital? I know you're tired, but working with you today, this is what I've been missing. This is what music should feel like." Margaret felt a familiar tug of professional pride mixed with personal uncertainty. "Let me think about it, Julia. Today was wonderful, but I'm still figuring out what comes next for me." After Julia left, Margaret sat at the piano and played through Clair de Lune again, letting herself fully experience the memory she'd shared with the music. Thomas on the porch, his hand covering hers, both of them content to sitting comfortable. Silence under the changing phases of the moon. For the first time since his death, remembering didn't just hurt, it also brought comfort. The memory was still theirs, still beautiful, still worth carrying forward. Margaret looked at the address on her coffee table, 142 Harmony Lane, where Elena Vasquez waited with whatever Thomas had planned next. After today's lesson, after feeling the joy of musical connection again, Margaret finally understood what Thomas had been trying to tell her. Music wasn't something she used to do. It was something she was meant to keep doing. Tomorrow, she decided she would visit Elena. The drive to Elena's studio on Friday morning felt like crossing into foreign territory. Margaret hadn't been downtown in over a year, and the arts district had changed more than she'd expected. New galleries lined the street alongside established. Music shops and young people with instrument cases moved purposefully between buildings that hummed with creative energy. 142 Harmony Lane was a converted Victorian house painted in warm terracotta with deep green trim. A discreet brass plaque by the front door read Vasquez Music Studio, where every voice finds its song. Through the lodge front windows, Margaret could see the corner of a grand piano and hear the faint sound of someone practicing scales. She sat in her car for several minutes, wearing the silver pendant Thomas had left for her and holding his final letter about Elena. The courage that had carried her through Julia's lesson seemed to have evaporated during the 20-minute drive. "You're overthinking again," she could almost hear Thomas say. "Elena is expecting you. Trust the plan." The front door opened before Margaret could knock. Elena Vasquez was smaller than Margaret had expected, probably in her early 60s, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in an elegant bun. She wore a flowing burgundy cardigan over black pants, and her eyes held the kind of warmth that came from years of working with nervous students. "Margaret," Elena said, as if they were old friends reuniting, "I've been wondering when you'd find your way here. Thomas said it might take a while, but that you'd come when you were ready." "I'm not sure I am ready," Margaret admitted, stepping into a foyer lined with photographs of students at recitals and competitions. "I'm not even sure why I'm here," Elena smiled. Thomas was very specific about that. He said you'd need to understand that this isn't about going backward. It's about going forward. "Come, let me show you the studio." The main room took Margaret's breath away. 3 grand pianos occupied the space, positioned to allow for both individual practice and ensemble work. The walls were lined with built-in bookcases filled with sheet music, and large windows let in natural light that made everything feel airy and inspiring. Several smaller practice rooms branched off the main space, each containing upright pianos and comfortable chairs. "It's beautiful," Margaret said, running her hand along the smooth surface of the nearest piano. "It's functional," Elena corrected. Gently, "Beauty is what happens when people make music here. Would you like some tea? I thought we could talk before you decide whether Thomas's idea makes sense for you." They settled in Elena's office, a cozy space with 2 comfortable chairs and walls lined with certificates, awards, and photographs spanning decades of musical achievements. Elena poured tea from a service that looked like it had been a treasured gift, and Margaret noticed her hands strong, graceful, clearly those of a pianist. "Thomas told me about your situation," Elena began carefully. "About losing him, about stepping away from music, about the charm that started you back toward finding yourself again." Margaret touched the pendant at her throat. "He had quite an elaborate plan. I'm still discovering pieces of it. He loved you very much. That was clear from our conversations." Elena sipped her tea thoughtfully. "He was also worried about you in a way that only someone who really knows you could be. He said, you've been defining yourself through service to others for so long that you'd forgotten Margaret Lawson was worth caring for on her own." The words echoed what Margaret had read in Thomas's letters, but hearing them from someone else gave them different weight. What exactly did he have in mind? Elena leaned forward slightly. "He wanted you to consider teaching again, but not the way you did before. Not elementary music education with its focus on group instruction and basic skills. He thought you might be interested in something more challenging, working with adult students who are returning to music after life interruptions." Margaret felt a flutter of interest mixed with apprehension. "I've only worked with children. Adults have different expectations, different needs." "They do," Elena agreed. "They're often more motivated, but also more self-critical. They bring life experience that can deepen their musical interpretation, but they also carry fears about being too old, too rusty, too late to really learn. It's challenging work, but incredibly rewarding." Elena stood and walked to a filing cabinet, returning with a folder. "I'd like to show you something. These are letters from some of my adult students, people who thought their musical lives were over until they found the courage to begin again." The letters were remarkable. A retired engineer who'd taken up piano at 70 and now played at his church. A divorced mother of 3 who'd returned to violin after 20 years and discovered it helped her process emotions she couldn't express any other way. A widower who'd learned guitar to play songs his late wife had loved, finding in music a way to honor her memory while creating something new. Thomas suggested that you might connect particularly well with students who are dealing with loss. Elena said quietly, "Not because you'd be counseling them, but because you'd understand that music can be both memory and hope." Margaret thought about her lesson with Julia, how natural it had felt to guide someone toward their own musical truth. Working with adults who brought complex life experiences to their learning might actually be easier in some ways. They would understand the emotional stakes of what they were attempting. "What would it involve?" Margaret asked. "I have 3 adult students right now who could benefit from individual instruction. One is a woman about your age who's returning to piano after her husband died. Another is a man in his 50s who always wanted to learn but never had time until his children left home. The third is a younger woman, 30-something, who played seriously in college but gave it up for career and family and now wants to reconnect with that part of herself." Elena paused, watching Margaret's reaction. "I wouldn't expect you to commit to anything long-term at first. Maybe work with one student, see how it feels. Decide if you want to continue." Margaret found herself thinking about the satisfaction she'd felt helping Julia connect emotionally with her music. The idea of working with adults who were making brave choices to pursue music despite their fears appealed to something deep in her teaching instincts. Thomas mentioned that you'd lost your husband too, Margaret said. How did you keep teaching music when everything felt different? Alana's expression grew thoughtful. For a while, I couldn't. Music felt too connected to the life David and I had shared. But eventually, I realized that avoiding music wasn't protecting his memory, it was dishonoring it. The music we made together didn't disappear when he died. It became part of who I am, part of what I can offer other people. She stood and walked to one of the pianos, playing a brief melodic phrase that was hauntingly beautiful. David composed that for our anniversary 1 year. For months after he died, I couldn't bear to hear it. Now I play it when I need to remember that love doesn't end, it transforms. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. This was what Thomas had been trying to tell her through his elaborate plan. Not that she should forget their life together, but that she should let it inform her future instead of defining its limits. Tell me about the students, Margaret said. Alana's face lit up. The woman who lost her husband is named Ruth. She's 72 and hasn't touched the piano in 5 years. She's tentative but determined, and I think she'd respond well to someone who understands grief without needing to discuss it constantly. Margaret nodded. She'd read Ruth's testimonial on Elena's website, the widow who'd written about feeling her husband listening when she played. Would you like to meet her? Elena asked. She comes in Saturday mornings. I can introduce you, let you observe a lesson, see if there's a connection. The idea terrified and excited Margaret in equal measure. She thought about Thomas's letters, encouraging her to trust the process, about Julia's transformation during their lesson, about the music box full of love letters urging her toward a future that honored their past without being trapped by it. Yes, Margaret said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. I'd like to meet Ruth, Elena smiled. Thomas said, you'd know when you were ready. I think he was right. As Margaret drove home, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 2 years' anticipation for tomorrow. Not just the nervous energy of facing something new, but genuine excitement about the possibility of connecting with another person through music. Thomas's plan was working, she realized. Not by erasing her grief or pretending their life together hadn't mattered, but by showing her that the love they'd shared was meant to be lived forward, not just remembered backward. That evening, she read another of his letters, one he'd written. On their 20th anniversary, music brought us together, he'd written, but it was never just about us. It was about what we could create together that made the world a little more beautiful. That doesn't end because I'm gone, my love. It continues through every life you touch, every student you inspire, every moment of joy you help someone discover. That's not just your gift, it's your responsibility. Margaret folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the music box. Tomorrow she would meet Ruth, and together they would see if music could indeed be both memory and hope. Margaret arrived at Elena's studio Saturday morning with a mixture of nervousness and curiosity. Through the window, she could see an older woman seated at one of the grand pianos, her posture careful but determined as she worked through what sounded like a simplified arrangement of a classical piece. Ruth Hendricks was indeed 72, with white hair styled in a practical bob and clothes that suggested comfort over fashion. When Elena introduced them, Ruth's handshake was firm, and her eyes held the particular clarity that came from having survived significant loss. Elena tells me you're considering teaching again, Ruth said without preamble. I hope you do. We need more teachers who understand that learning music at our age isn't about becoming concert pianists, it's about becoming ourselves again. Margaret settled into a chair where she could observe Ruth's lesson. Elena's teaching style was patient, but direct, focusing on helping Ruth connect emotionally with the music rather than simply executing the technical requirements. It was exactly the approach Margaret had used with Julia but watching it applied to an adult student gave her new insights into the possibilities. "Tell me what this phrase means to you," Elena said, as Ruth worked through a section of Bandage. "Not what you think it should mean, but what it actually makes you feel." Ruth paused, her hands still on the keys. "It makes me think of conversations I used to have with Harold. The way we could communicate without words after 47 years of marriage. This melody feels like that, like it's saying something important without needing to explain exactly what." Elena nodded. "Then play it like a conversation with Harold. Let the music carry that intimacy." When Ruth played the passage again, it was transformed. The same notes, but infused with a tenderness that spoke of deep personal connection. Margaret felt goosebumps rise on her arms. This was why she'd become a music teacher in the first place, to witness these moments when technique became art. Through the alchemy of human experience. After the lesson, Elena suggested they all have coffee together. As they settled in the studio's small kitchen, Ruth turned to Margaret with direct curiosity. "Elena mentioned you lost your husband recently. How long has it been?" 2 years, Margaret replied, appreciating Ruth's straightforward approach. "Though I'm just now starting to figure out how to live with it instead of just surviving it." Ruth nodded knowingly. "Harold's been gone 3 years. The first year, I couldn't even listen to music. It all reminded me of him. The second year, I could listen but not play. This year I decided that avoiding music wasn't honoring his memory. It was wasting it. He loved hearing me play, so I'm learning to play for both of us now." The conversation continued naturally. Two widows sharing the particular understanding that comes from having loved deeply and lost completely. But it was Elena's next question that changed everything. "Margaret, Ruth mentioned something yesterday that I thought might interest you. About the music festival Harold used to organize." "Ruth, would you tell her about that?" Ruth's face brightened. "Oh yes, Harold was passionate about the community music festival. Ran it for 15 years before he got too sick to continue. It was his way of bringing together musicians of all ages and skill levels, professionals alongside amateurs, children with their grandparents, classical musicians jamming with folk artists. The whole community came together for one weekend every spring." Margaret felt a strange flutter of recognition. "What was it called?" "Harmony Days," Ruth said. "Harold always said music was the universal language, and the festival proved it. We had everything from symphony orchestra pieces to gospel choirs to local rock bands. It stopped after Harold died. No one else wanted to take on the organizational challenge." Elena was watching Margaret carefully. "The festival used to be held at Riverside Park, didn't it? Where the old bandstand is." "That's right," Ruth confirmed. "Though we outgrew that space years ago and moved to the high school auditorium. Harold always dreamed of bringing it back to the park, making it a true community celebration again." Margaret's heart began racing as pieces clicked into place. "Ruth, was your husband Harold Hendricks? Did he teach at the high school?" "Yes, for 30 years. Music director and band teacher. Why?" "I knew Harold," Margaret said slowly. "We worked together on district music programs for years. He was always trying to get the elementary schools more involved in community music events." Ruth stared at her. "You're Margaret Lawson? Harold talked about you all the time. He said you were the best elementary music teacher in the district. That you understood how to make music accessible to everyone, not just the naturally gifted kids." Elena was smiling as if she'd been waiting for this moment. "This is what Thomas planned, isn't it? He knew about the connection between Harold and Margaret, knew that Ruth was looking for a way to honor Harold's memory." Margaret felt the breath leave her lungs as the full scope of Thomas's scheme became clear. This wasn't just about her returning to teaching. It was about something much larger. "Elena, do you have Thomas's notebook? The one he left for me?" Elena disappeared into her office and returned with a familiar black leather journal. Margaret hadn't seen this one before. It was identical to the Operation Breadcrumbs notebook she'd found in Thomas's workshop, but labeled Phase 2. Margaret opened it with trembling hands. The first entry was dated February 1st, 2023, 6 weeks before his death. Margaret will resist the idea at first, Thomas had written. She'd think it's too ambitious, too public, too much responsibility for someone still learning to live with grief. But Harold Hendricks had the right idea. Music is the universal language, and our community needs an annual celebration that brings everyone together. Margaret has the skills to organize it, the connections to make it happen, and the heart to make it meaningful. Margaret looked up at Ruth and Elena, both watching her with expectant expressions. He wanted me to restart the Harmony Days Festival, she said, the words feeling surreal as she spoke them. Elena nodded. He contacted Harold before his death, actually spoke with him about the possibility. Harold was excited about passing the torch to someone he respected, but he died before they could meet in person. Ruth leaned forward eagerly. Margaret, would you consider it? I know it's a huge undertaking, but I'd help however I could. Harold left detailed notes about how he organized everything: vendor contacts, permit requirements, scheduling systems. It's all there, waiting for someone with the vision to bring it back to life. Margaret flipped through more pages of Thomas's notebook, finding detailed plans that took her breath away. He'd researched venue options, contacted local musicians, even outlined a preliminary budget. The festival would be a 3-day event featuring everything from children's choirs to adult community bands, from solo classical performances to collaborative jam sessions. The elementary school music programs would be the heart of it, one entry read. Margaret knows every music teacher in the district, understands how to showcase young talent without overwhelming young performers. But the real magic would happen when she brings together all the adult learners, the community bands, the church choirs, everyone who makes music for the joy of it rather than the perfection of it. Another entry made Margaret's eyes fill with tears. This isn't just about giving Margaret a project to focus on. It's about showing her that the 37 years she spent teaching children weren't just a job. They were preparation for something bigger. She has the skills to create community through music, to honor both Harold's legacy and our own. The festival would be her masterpiece, not because she'd perform in it, but because she'd make it possible for hundreds of others to perform together. Margaret looked up to find Ruth and Elena watching her with hopeful expressions. I haven't organized anything bigger than a 5th-grade recorder concert in years, Margaret said weakly. A community festival would involve permits, insurance, coordinating dozens of performers, managing volunteers. All things you've done before, just on a smaller scale, Elena interrupted gently. And you wouldn't be doing it alone. Ruth has Harold's organizational systems. I have connections throughout the local music community. And according to Thomas's notes, he already spoke with several people who'd be willing to help. Ruth reached across the table and squeezed Margaret's hand. Harold always said the Harmony Days Festival was his love letter to the community. What if we made it a love letter to Harold and Thomas both? A way of honoring what they gave us while creating something new for the future? Margaret felt the familiar sensation of Thomas orchestrating events from beyond the grave. But this time, it didn't feel manipulative. It felt like a gift. Not just to her, but to everyone who would benefit from having music brought back into community life. When would this happen? Margaret asked, already knowing she was going to say yes. Harold always held it the second weekend in May, Ruth said. That gives us about 6 weeks to plan. Tight, but doable if we start immediately. Elena smiled. Thomas thought you'd be ready by now. He was counting on you being ready. Margaret closed the notebook and looked around the table at these 2 women who'd been brought into her life through Thomas's careful planning, Ruth carrying Harold's legacy forward, Elena providing the bridge between grief and purpose, and herself being offered the chance to transform. 37 years of teaching children into a celebration that would bring an entire community together through music. 6 weeks to organize a community music festival, Margaret said, testing how the words felt. They felt terrifying and exciting and exactly like something the old Margaret would have tackled with enthusiasm. "Will you do it?" Ruth asked. Margaret thought about Thomas's final letter about Elena, about trusting the plan and trusting herself. She thought about Julia's transformation during their lesson, about Ruth's courage in returning to piano after years of silence, about Harold's dream of bringing music back to the community. "Yes," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "Let's bring Harmony Days back to life." The 6 weeks that followed were a wind of activity that transformed Margaret's quiet house into festival headquarters. Her dining room table disappeared under spreadsheets tracking performer applications, vendor contracts, and volunteer schedules. The silence that had defined her home for 2 years was replaced by constant phone calls, planning meetings, and the cheerful chaos of community organization. Ruth proved to be an invaluable partner, arriving each morning with Harold's meticulously organized files and the energy of someone who'd found new purpose. Elena coordinated outreach to local music teachers and private instructors, while Margaret discovered that her decades of managing school concerts had given her exactly the skills needed for large-scale event planning. Thomas knew what he was doing, Margaret said one afternoon as she and Ruth reviewed vendor applications in her living room. "I keep finding notes in his planning that show he understood this would be exactly what I needed, complex enough to challenge me, meaningful enough to matter, collaborative enough that I wouldn't be doing it alone." Ruth looked up from a list of potential food trucks. "Harold used to say that the best way to honor the dead was to live so fully that they'd be proud to have known you. I think both our husbands would be pretty amazed at what we're creating." The festival was taking shape beautifully. 37 musical acts had signed up, ranging from the elementary school beginning band to a local blues ensemble comprised entirely of retirees. The high school's jazz choir was collaborating with the community adult chorus for a special intergenerational performance. 3 food trucks had committed to providing meals, and local businesses were sponsoring everything from sound equipment to promotional materials. Most surprisingly, Margaret found herself enjoying the administrative challenges. Each problem that arose, permit complications, scheduling conflicts, equipment needs, felt like a puzzle to solve rather than an overwhelming burden. She was using skills she'd forgotten she possessed, drawing on decades of experience managing the complex logistics of school music programs. "You're different," Sarah observed during one of their Tuesday phone calls. "You sound like yourself again, but more so, if that makes sense." Margaret considered this. "I think Thomas's plan worked better than even he expected. I'm not just returning to who I was before he died. I'm becoming who we might have been together if we'd had more time." The most meaningful aspect of the planning was watching the community respond. When word spread about Harmony Days returning, Margaret's phone rang constantly with offers of help, donations of equipment, and stories about what the festival had meant to people in its earlier incarnation. Julia Patterson volunteered to help with youth performer coordination, and Margaret found herself officially taking the teenager on as a regular student. Working with Julia had led to 2 more adult students, the divorced mother Elena had mentioned, who was rediscovering violin as a way to process her own life transitions, and a shy accountant who'd always dreamed of learning piano but never thought he was musical enough. Teaching again felt like putting on clothes that fit perfectly after years of wearing the wrong size. Each lesson brought its own rewards. The moment when a student connected emotionally with a piece, the satisfaction of helping someone overcome a technical challenge, the privilege of witnessing musical growth and personal discovery. But as the festival approached, Margaret found herself facing unexpected emotional challenges. The closer they got to the actual event, the more acutely she felt Thomas's absence. He should have been there to see the community come together, to witness the result of his elaborate planning, to share in the joy of what they'd created. 2 weeks before the festival, Margaret discovered another item in Thomas's music box, a letter she'd somehow missed during her initial reading. This one was different from the others, marked with specific instructions. Open only when you're sure the festival will actually happen. My dearest Margaret, the letter began, if you're reading this, then you've done something I wasn't entirely sure you'd have the courage to attempt. You've taken on a project that honors not just Harold's memory, but the best parts of who. You've always been the teacher who sees potential in everyone, the organizer who can turn chaos into harmony, the woman who makes beautiful things happen. Margaret paused in her reading, looking around her transformed house. In 6 weeks, she'd organized a community festival, taken on 4 new students, and reconnected with dozens of colleagues she'd lost touch with since retirement. The woman, who'd been hiding in silence for 2 years, felt like a different person entirely. But I suspect that as the festival approaches, you're feeling my absence more acutely than you have since the early days of grief. That's natural, my love. Every significant moment from now on will carry the bittersweet recognition that I'm not there to share it with you. The key is learning to feel that sadness without letting it diminish the joy of what you're accomplishing. Thomas's insight was, as always, precise. Margaret had been struggling with exactly that tension pride in what she'd created mixed with profound sadness that he wasn't there to witness it. Here's what I want you to remember, the letter continued. Every musician who performs at the festival carries forward something you taught them, directly or indirectly. Every audience member who feels moved by the music experiences a gift you helped make possible. Every moment of community joy that happens, because you had the courage to organize this event, is a living memorial to what we built together. Margaret felt tears on her cheeks, but continued reading. You are not alone in this, Margaret. Harold's spirit is there in every organizational detail Ruth contributes. Elena's wisdom guides every musical decision. And I am there in every moment when you choose to create beauty instead of hiding from it. Every time you help someone else discover their musical voice. Every instant when you remember that love multiplies when it's shared rather than hoarded. The letter concluded with practical instructions that made. Margaret laughed through her tears. Check the bottom drawer of my workshop desk. There's one more surprise I'd been saving for opening night. Margaret walked to the basement, feeling Thomas's presence so strongly, it was almost as if he were walking beside her. In the bottom drawer of his workshop desk, beneath old woodworking magazines and project plans, she found a wooden box she'd never seen before. Inside was a conductor's baton, not just any baton, but an elegant piece crafted from dark walnut with silver inlays. A small card explained its history. This belonged to my grandfather, who led the church choir for 40 years. He gave it to me when I married you, said it was for when the music in your life needed direction. I always thought he meant metaphorically, but now I think he knew exactly what he was talking about. Margaret held the baton carefully, feeling its perfect weight and balance. She'd never conducted anything larger than a 5th-grade chorus, but holding this piece of family history, she could envision herself leading the combined community groups. In the festival's finale, all the choirs, bands, and solo performers joined together for one grand collaborative number. The final piece of paper in the box was a musical score, handwritten in Thomas's careful notation. It was an arrangement of amazing grace for multiple voices and instruments, designed to accommodate performers of varying skill levels while creating a powerful, unified sound. For the finale, Thomas had written at the top of the score, something everyone can sing, something that speaks to grace received and grace given, something that celebrates both endings and beginnings. Margaret sat in Thomas's workshop, surrounded by the tools he'd used to create beautiful things from raw materials, holding the baton that would help her shape community voices into a single song of celebration. For the first time since his death, she felt not just his love reaching across the grave, but his absolute confidence in her ability to create something meaningful from the scattered pieces of her new life. 3 days before the festival, Margaret called a final planning meeting. Ruth arrived with her usual organizational efficiency. Elena brought updates from the participating musicians, and Clara had volunteered to help coordinate day of logistics. As they sat around Margaret's dining room table, reviewing the final schedule, Margaret realized she was looking at something Thomas had envisioned, but couldn't have fully predicted: a chosen family bound together by shared purpose and mutual support. "I have something to show you," Margaret said, retrieving the conductor's baton from its place of honor on the piano. "Thomas left this for the festival finale. I want to conduct the closing song, but I need all of you with me up there. Ruth, would you announce the piece and tell people about Harold's vision for community music? Elena, would you help me direct the combined groups? Clara, would you make sure everyone feels included, even if they're not official performers?" Looking around the table at these women who become so important to her healing journey, Margaret felt the truth of what Thomas had been trying to teach her. Love didn't end with death. It multiplied through every life it touched, every connection it fostered, every moment of beauty it inspired others to create. "Harold would have loved this," Ruth said softly. "All of it. The collaboration, the music, the way you've brought people together." "Thomas would have too," Margaret replied. "In fact, I think he's going to love it. I think they both are." The morning of the Harmony Days festival dawned with the kind of perfect May weather that seemed orchestrated by benevolent forces. Margaret woke before her alarm, her heart racing with a mixture of excitement and terror that reminded her of the Christmas mornings of her childhood. As she dressed carefully in the navy blue dress she'd chosen for conducting professional but approachable, formal but not intimidating, Margaret caught her reflection in the bedroom mirror. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the hollow-eyed widow who discovered a silver charm in her ear just 2 months ago. This woman had purpose in her posture, light in her eyes, and the kind of energy that came from being fully engaged with life again. She fastened the silver pendant around her neck, feeling Thomas's presence like a warm hand on her shoulder. "This is it," she said aloud to the empty room. "I hope you're proud of what we've built." Riverside Park was already bustling with activity when Margaret arrived at 7 in the morning. The festival wouldn't officially begin until noon, but vendors were setting up food trucks, sound technicians were testing microphones, and early volunteers were hanging banners and arranging chairs. The park's old bandstand had been expanded with a temporary stage that could accommodate everything from solo performers to the 40-piece combined community band. Ruth was already there, clipboard in hand and managing volunteers with the efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before. She spotted Margaret and hurried over, her face glowing with excitement. "It's really happening," Ruth said, gesturing toward the bustling scene around them. Harold would be beside himself with joy. "Look at this turnout already, and we haven't even started yet." Elena appeared from behind the sound equipment, her usually composed demeanor showing cracks of nervous energy. "Margaret, the youth groups are warming up in the community center, and they sound incredible. Julia's going to knock everyone's socks off with that chopping piece." And the adult beginners ensemble actually managed to get through their entire set without any major disasters during rehearsal. Margaret felt a surge of pride mixed with maternal protectiveness for all the performers who would be sharing their musical gifts today. Many of them were stepping far outside their comfort zones. Adult students performing publicly for the first time, children showcasing months of practice, community groups collaborating across age and experience levels. "How are you feeling?" Clara asked, joining their huddle near the main stage. She'd volunteered to coordinate performer check-ins and was wearing a headset that made her look like a professional event manager. "Terrified and exhilarated in equal measure," Margaret admitted. I keep thinking about all the things that could go wrong: sound system failures, performers getting stage fright, scheduling conflicts we didn't anticipate. Or, Elena suggested gently, you could think about all the things that are going to go right. Beautiful music being shared, community connections being strengthened, people discovering they're braver than they thought. Margaret nodded, trying to absorb Elena's optimism. She walked to the edge of the stage and looked out over the park, imagining it filled with families, music lovers, and curious community members drawn by the promise of an afternoon of diverse musical performances. The first performers began arriving around 10 o'clock. Margaret watched Julia emerge from her parents' car, violin case in hand and wearing the kind of nervous excitement that preceded important performances. The teenager had worked incredibly hard over the past weeks, not just on her own pieces, but helping younger students prepare for their ensemble performances. "Mrs. Lawson," Julia called out, hurrying over with her characteristic enthusiasm. "I practiced until 11 last night, and I think I finally got the emotional phrasing you were talking about. The chop-in actually feels like a conversation now instead of just a series of technical exercises." Margaret felt the familiar warmth that came from watching a student's growth. "That's exactly what we were working toward. Remember, once you're on stage, trust your preparation and let the music carry you. The audience wants you to succeed." As more performers arrived, Margaret found herself slipping into the role that felt most natural: teacher, encourager, guide. She moved among the various groups, offering last-minute technical suggestions, calming pre-performance nerves, and helping performers visualize their success rather than their potential failures. The elementary school beginning band huddled together, like young soldiers preparing for battle, their instruments gleaming in the morning sun. Margaret knelt down to their level, speaking in the gentle but confident tone she perfected over decades of working with nervous young performers. "Remember what we talked about during rehearsal," she said. "You're not playing for judges or critics today. You're playing for people who love you, your families, your neighbors, your community. They want to celebrate how much you've learned, not critique how much you still have to learn." 8-year-old Emma raised her hand tentatively. "Mrs. Lawson, what if I forget how the song goes?" Margaret smiled, remembering countless similar questions from her teaching years. "Then you follow Mrs. Peterson's conducting and play whatever notes feel right. Music is forgiving, sweetheart. The important thing is that you're brave enough to try." By 11:30, the park was filling with audience members. Margaret was amazed at the turnout: families spreading blankets on the grass, elderly couples setting up lawn chairs, teenagers gathering in clusters near the food trucks. The community had responded to the festival with an enthusiasm that exceeded even her most optimistic projections. Sarah and Michael had driven in from their respective cities, bringing Margaret's grandchildren to witness their grandmother's return to public musical life. 8-year-old Emma, not the performer, but Margaret's granddaughter, clutched a homemade sign reading, "We love you, Grandma," while 12-year-old David set up his phone to record what he announced would be Grandma's conducting debut for posterity. "Mom, this is incredible," Sarah said, surveying the bustling festival scene. 2 months ago you could barely leave the house, and now you've organized something that's bringing hundreds of people together." Margaret felt a complex mix of emotions: pride in what she'd accomplished, gratitude for her family's support, and the persistent ache of wishing Thomas could witness this moment. But increasingly, the sadness was accompanied by something else: a deep certainty that he was somehow present in every detail of this day he'd worked so hard to orchestrate. "Ladies and gentlemen," Clara's voice came through the sound system as the noon hour approached. "Welcome to the Revival of Harmony Days, our community's celebration of music in all its forms. We'd like to begin today by acknowledging 2 people whose vision made this festival possible. Harold Hendricks, who organized these celebrations for 15 years until his death 3 years ago, and Thomas Lawson, whose love for his wife Margaret inspired the festival's return to life. Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes as applause filled the park. She looked out over the sea of faces, some familiar, some unknown, all gathered because of Thomas's elaborate plan to draw her back into community life through the universal language of music. Ruth appeared beside her with a microphone. "Margaret, would you like to say a few words before we begin?" Margaret accepted the microphone with trembling hands, looking out over the crowd of people who'd come to celebrate music together. She thought about Thomas's letters, about his confidence in her ability to create beauty from scattered pieces, about his belief that love multiplied when it was shared rather than hoarded. 2 months ago, she began, her voice steadying as she spoke, "I thought my music-making days were over. I thought that when you lose the person who was your closest harmony partner, the song has to end. But today, looking at all of you, listening to the warmth-ups and sound checks happening all around us, I realized that love doesn't end the music. It teaches the music to find new voices." The crowd had grown quiet, listening with the kind of attention that told Margaret her words were resonating with people who understood loss, change, and the courage required to begin again. Harold Hendricks started this festival because he believed music was the universal language that could bring any community together. My husband Thomas believed that the music we make together doesn't disappear when we're gone. It continues through every life we've touched, every student we've inspired, every moment of beauty we've helped create. Margaret paused, feeling the weight of the conductor's baton in her pocket and the silver pendant against her throat. "Today we're not just celebrating music," she continued. "We're celebrating the truth that beautiful things multiply when they're shared. That community is created one song at a time, and that it's never too late to find your voice again. Let the music begin." The festival unfolded like a perfectly orchestrated symphony, each performance building on the last to create something greater than the sum of its parts. Margaret moved through the afternoon like a conductor managing multiple sections of an enormous orchestra, troubleshooting minor crises, encouraging nervous performers, and watching in amazement as Thomas's vision came to life around her. Julia's performance of the Chopin-Minute Waltz was everything Margaret had hoped for and more. The teenager took the stage with confidence that radiated from her preparation, and when she began to play, the music carried all the emotional authenticity they'd worked to develop. Margaret watched from the wings, feeling the particular pride that came from witnessing a student's breakthrough performance, but it was the community ensemble performances that truly captured the spirit of what Harold and Thomas had envisioned. The adult beginners group, led by Elena and including Ruth on piano, performed a simplified arrangement of Bridge Over Troubled Water that moved several audience members to tears. Their technique was imperfect, but their joy was infectious. And Margaret realized this was exactly what community music should be: accessible, inclusive, emotionally honest. The intergenerational choir, combining high school students with community adult singers, delivered a performance of What a Wonderful World that had the entire audience singing along by the final chorus. Margaret stood at the side of the stage, watching 80-year-olds harmonizing with 16-year-olds, and felt Thomas's presence so strongly she looked around expecting to see him nod as the afternoon progressed toward the finale. Margaret felt her nervousness about conducting intensify. She'd been practicing with Thomas's baton in private, but leading a group of nearly 60 performers in front of hundreds of audience members was unlike anything she'd ever attempted. Clara appeared beside her during the penultimate performance, carrying the wooden box that contained the family baton. "Time for the grand finale," she said, with a smile that mixed encouragement with understanding of Margaret's nerves. Margaret lifted the baton from its resting place, feeling the smooth walnut warm under her palm. The weight was perfect, the balance ideal for the large, sweeping gestures she'd need to coordinate so many performers. She thought about Thomas's grandfather, leading church choirs for 40 years, and about the musical leadership that apparently ran in the family line she'd married into. Ruth took the stage to introduce the finale, her voice carrying clearly over the expectant crowd. Our final performance today will be led by Margaret Lawson, using a conductor's baton that has guided musicians for over 80 years. The piece is Amazing Grace, arranged by her late husband Thomas specifically for this moment. We invite everyone, performers and audience members alike, to join us in celebrating the grace that allows us to begin again, to find beauty after loss, to create harmony from individual voices. Margaret walked onto the stage to thunderous applause, the baton held lightly in her right hand. Before her, arranged in a semicircle, were all the day's performers, children with their recorders and violins, teenagers with their guitars and cellos, adults with voices ranging from uncertain to trained, community band members with instruments, gleaming in the afternoon sun. She looked out over the audience and saw her family in the front section, Sarah and Michael beaming with pride, her grandchildren holding up their phones to record the moment. Elena stood at the edge of the performance area, ready to assist with the larger vocal groups. Clara had positioned herself where she could encourage audience participation. Margaret raised the baton, and an expectant hush fell over the park. In that moment of silence before the music began, she felt the weight of everything that had led to this moment. Thomas's elaborate plan, her own journey from grief to purpose, the community coming together to celebrate their shared humanity. Through song, she brought the baton down, and the opening notes of Amazing Grace filled the air. Thomas's arrangement was masterful, allowing each group to contribute according to their abilities while building to moments where all voices joined in powerful unison. The melody was simple enough for everyone to follow, but the harmonies were rich enough to showcase the more experienced musicians. As the song progressed, Margaret found herself conducting not just the organized performers, but the entire gathering. Audience members began standing and singing, their voices adding to the swelling sound that filled Riverside Park and spilled out into the surrounding neighborhood. Margaret could see people stopping on nearby streets, drawn by the music, adding their voices to the impromptu community choir. The second verse built even higher, with Julia's violin adding a counter-melody that soared above the voices, while the community band provided a rhythmic foundation that kept everyone together. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face, but her conducting remained steady and confident, guided by an inner certainty she hadn't felt since before Thomas's death. For the final verse, Margaret lowered the baton and sang with her own voice for the first time in 2 years. Her alto, still strong despite months of silence, joined the hundreds of voices around her in the words that had taken on profound personal meaning. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. The song ended with a sustained chord that seemed to hang in the air long after the last voice faded. The silence that followed was profound, not empty, but full of the shared recognition that something transcendent had just occurred. Then the applause began, starting slowly and building to a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Margaret stood at the center of it all, the conductor's baton still in her hand, surrounded by the musical community she'd helped create. She looked up at the spring sky, feeling Thomas's love and approval washing over her like sunlight, and knew with absolute certainty that this was exactly what he'd envisioned when he'd begun planning his elaborate farewell gift. Ruth appeared beside her on the stage, taking the microphone with tears in her eyes. Harold always said that music was the closest thing to magic that ordinary people could create together. Today, Margaret Lawson has proven that magic is real, that love never truly ends, and that amazing grace can indeed help us begin again. As the crowd began to disperse, many people approached the stage to thank Margaret personally. Former students from her teaching years, colleagues she hadn't seen since retirement, community members who'd been moved by the day's performances. Each conversation was a reminder that the music teacher she'd been had touched more lives than she'd realized, and that the community leader she was becoming would touch many more. "Mrs. Lawson," a young mother said, holding her 5-year-old daughter's hand, "Emma has been talking about wanting to learn piano since your opening speech. Do you think you might consider taking on another student?" Margaret looked down at the little girl, who was clutching a program from the festival and gazing up at her with the kind of musical curiosity Margaret had seen in thousands of young faces over the years. "I think that could be arranged," Margaret said, feeling the future opening up before her in ways Thomas had predicted, but she was only now beginning to understand. 3 months after the Harmony Days festival, Margaret's house had transformed once again, but this time into something she'd never imagined during her years as an elementary school teacher. The dining room had been converted into a studio space, with 2 digital pianos positioned so she could teach both individual and small group lessons. The living room, where Thomas's grand piano still held center stage, hosted weekly community music gatherings that had grown from Elena's original adult education students to include families, retirees, and anyone curious about making music together. Margaret stood at her kitchen window on a Tuesday morning in August, watching Clara's car pull into the driveway for their weekly coffee. What had begun as a professional relationship during that fateful charm discovery had evolved into one of the most meaningful friendships of Margaret's life. Clara had become not just a witness to Margaret's transformation, but an active participant in the musical community that had grown around her teaching. "Good morning, Mrs. Conductor," Clara called out as she entered through the back door, carrying a bag of pastries from the bakery downtown. The title had stuck after the festival, used with affection by everyone who'd witnessed Margaret's debut as a community musical leader. "Good morning, dear," Margaret replied, pouring coffee into the mugs that had become their ritual. "How did Emma's lesson go yesterday?" Clara's 5-year-old niece had become one of Margaret's youngest students, starting with simple rhythm exercises and graduating to picking out melodies on the piano. Watching the little girl discover her musical voice reminded Margaret daily of why she'd fallen in love with teaching in the first place. She played "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star" for the entire family at dinner. Clara laughed. 4 times. "Her parents are beginning to understand why you always emphasized the importance of practice time limits." They settled at the kitchen table, which still held space for the silver charm that had started Margaret's journey. She'd had it mounted in a small frame alongside the wedding photo where Thomas wore the matching piece, creating a memorial that honored their love while celebrating the new life it had made possible. "Any word from Ruth about next year's festival?" Clara asked. Margaret smiled. The success of this year's Harmony Days had led to immediate planning for an expanded event the following spring. Ruth had thrown herself into the organizing with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found her calling, while Margaret focused on developing the educational programming that would make the festival a true community learning experience. "She's already booked the high school auditorium as a backup venue in case we outgrow the park," Margaret said. "And Elena has 3 other music studios interested in participating. We might actually need multiple stages." The growth felt manageable because it was organic, driven by genuine community enthusiasm rather than forced expansion. Margaret had learned to trust the same instincts that had guided her teaching career. When something felt right, it usually was, and when it felt forced, it was worth questioning. "Speaking of Elena," Clara said, "she mentioned that you're considering something new. Something about a grief support program?" Margaret nodded, feeling the familiar flutter of excitement that came with new possibilities. "We've had several people reach out after the festival widows, mostly, but also others dealing with various kinds of loss, asking if music could help them the way it helped me. Elena thinks there might be a need for a formal program that combines grief support with musical expression. The idea had grown from conversations with Ruth about their shared experience of learning to live with loss while remaining open to joy. They'd both found that music provided a unique bridge between honoring the past and embracing the future, and they wondered if that healing could be shared more intentionally with others facing similar challenges. Thomas would have loved that, Clara said softly. Using music to help people find their way back to themselves. Margaret picked up the most recent letter from Thomas's collection, one she discovered just last week, hidden in the very back of the music box behind letters she'd already read. As if he'd known she'd need encouragement for whatever came after the festival's success. He actually predicted it, Margaret said, unfolding the letter. Listen to this. If the festival works, the way I hope it will, you'll start seeing connections between music and healing that go beyond your own grief. You've always had the gift of helping people discover they're more capable than they believed. That gift doesn't disappear because you've learned to grieve well. It becomes more precious because you understand now what people need when they're full. Struggling to find their voices again. Clara shook her head in amazement. That man thought of everything. Almost everything, Margaret corrected with a smile. He couldn't have predicted that his nurse would become one of my dearest friends, or that his festival would lead to a teaching practice that feels more fulfilling than anything I did during my official career. Some of the best parts of this new life have been surprises. The afternoon brought its usual parade of students. Julia had continued lessons throughout the summer and was preparing for college auditions, but she'd also become Margaret's assistant for the younger students, creating a mentorship chain that reminded Margaret of the best aspects of school music programs. 5-year-old Emma arrived with her grandmother, who stayed for the lesson and often ended up joining the informal adult practice sessions that followed. The divorced mother Elena had originally mentioned Patricia came for her violin lesson and lingered afterward to help with scheduling the community music gatherings that had become a weekly highlight for many participants. But it was Margaret's newest student who provided the most powerful reminder of how far she'd traveled from the silent, isolated woman who'd hidden her ear pain for months. David Chun was a recent widower, 73 years old, who'd approached Margaret after reading about the festival in the local newspaper. My wife always wanted me to learn piano, he'd explained during their first meeting. She said I had musical hands, but was too stubborn to try. Now that she's gone, I keep thinking maybe learning might be a way of keeping a promise to her. Working with David felt like looking in a mirror that reflected her own journey back to music. He approached the lessons with the same mixture of grief and tentative hope that Margaret remembered from her first weeks of reading Thomas's letters. And watching his gradual confidence build reminded her that healing wasn't a destination but an ongoing process of choosing engagement over withdrawal. As the day's last student left, Margaret sat at Thomas's piano and played through the piece that had become her personal anthem. The Amazing Grace arrangement he'd written for the festival finale. Her technique had improved dramatically over the months of regular practice, but more importantly, her emotional connection to the music had deepened into something that felt both personal and universal. The house settled into its evening quiet, but it was no longer the hollow silence that had characterized her widowhood. This was the comfortable quiet of a home filled with purpose, where music happened daily and people gathered regularly to share the joy of creative expression. Margaret opened Thomas's music box one more time, not to read another letter, but simply to wind the mechanism and listen to their wedding song. The melody still carried memories of their life together, but now it also carried forward-looking themes, the students she would teach, the community connections she would foster, the grief she would help others transform into something beautiful. On her bedside table, alongside Thomas's reading glasses that she'd finally moved from the living room, sat a pile of student application forms for the fall semester. Word about her teaching had spread through the community networks that had formed around the festival, and she had more requests than she could accommodate. The applications represented not just a full teaching schedule, but a life rebuilt around the fundamental truth Thomas had helped her rediscover: that the gifts we're given are meant to be shared, that love multiplies when it's expressed through service to others, and that it's never too late to find our voices again. As Margaret prepared for bed, she noticed the silver pendant lying on her dresser, no longer worn constantly as a talisman, but treasured as a reminder of the journey it had initiated. Tomorrow she would teach 6 students, attend a planning meeting for next year's festival, and work on arrangements for the grief support program that would launch in the fall. It was exactly the kind of full, purposeful life Thomas had envisioned when he begun orchestrating his elaborate farewell gift. But more than that, it was the life Margaret had chosen to create from the raw materials of his love, her own resilience, and the community that had formed around their shared belief in the transformative power of music. Thomas's plan had worked, but not because it had brought back the woman she used to be. It had worked because it had helped her discover the woman she was meant to become, someone who understood that love doesn't end with death, but continues through every life it touches, every student it inspires, every moment of beauty it helps create. In the silence of her bedroom, Margaret could almost hear Thomas's voice joining hers in the words that had become her daily prayer: "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see." The music would continue tomorrow, and the day after that, and for all the tomorrows Thomas had made possible through his final, most loving composition, the symphony of Margaret's new life.